China has very high growth rates, which means that its economy will continue to rise and will continue to become bigger and bigger in comparison to economy of the United States and economies of other states in the world. In this graph, you see a little bit different numbers. It is because this graph shows us the shares of national economies in the world economy based on gross domestic product without purchasing power parity. That is why, according to some statistics, economy of China is still on the second place, but if we consider high rates of its growth, it will definitely become economy number one in the next several years. The third statement is that China is the core of the biggest economic region of the world. In the recent decades, the center of world economy has moved from the European or Euro-Atlantic region to the Asia-Pacific region, and China is in the center of this region, as you see in the graph. However, despite this fact, despite being the core of this region, the economic core, China still has no trade bloc like the United States or the Russian Federation do, as we discussed in the previous lectures. China tries to establish such a bloc. It is called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It tries to sign such a partnership with countries of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and even South Asia. But this project is still in the process of negotiations, and nobody knows whether we will see such a bloc in the future led by China or no. Today, currently, rather than being part of a trade bloc, China prefers to sign bilateral free trade agreements with other countries. In this map, you can see a plenty of these trade agreements between China and states in Southeast Asia and Pakistan, which is the leading military partner of China in security sphere. The fact that China is not so successful in terms of establishment of its own trade bloc in the region partly comes from the weakness of Chinese economy in the 20th century. As we remember from the previous graph, when geopolitics emerged in the European countries, China already had a relatively low share in the world economy, especially if we compare this share with the shares in the previous years. And also China suffered from several military conflicts in the first half of the century. So Chinese economic strategy in the end of the 20th century became attraction of foreign direct investment in 1980s and 1990s. So for a long time, China was very concentrated on its domestic economic development. And only in the recent couple decades, it changed its strategy, which can be characterized or called as a go global strategy, to encourage Chinese firms, primarily state-owned enterprises, to invest overseas and to bring to China more economic influence worldwide. The new Go Global strategy was driven by three main factors. The first factor, massive accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. In this graph, you see that in the recent decade, China was and still is in the first place in the international ranking of foreign exchange reserves, having much more such reserves than any other country in the world. In this map, you can see that position China is even more impressive if we compare it with many other developed countries in the European region or with the United States. Finally, we can say that China has a lot of money, financial resources. China has natural resources, according to the second factor. So the last thing that it needs is to develop globally competitive firms with their own brands and to obtain technology and management skills, which is the third factor. Altogether, in the recent couple of decades, these factors contributed to growth of Chinese economy and to the overall economic power, which nowadays China is ready to convert into its geopolitical activity. Ultimately, we can underline several strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese economy and geoeconomics at large. Among strengths, we should definitely mention sustainable national economy of China, meaning its big domestic market, natural resources and financial resources.
On the one hand, the fact that China has a strong domestic economy means that it is less dependent on other countries. On the other hand, as long as China has a lot of resources and is deeply involved into international trade, being a very big and very economically powerful part or member of this trade, means that potentially China can use all these instruments to influence the other countries. And finally, we should definitely mention global investment, because China has resources and China is ready to export these resources to invest them into other countries, into other economies. And this mechanism also potentially can be used by China in order to manipulate or influence decisions in other countries, in the countries abroad. However, the fact that China does have all these advantages does not mean that China successfully implements its geoeconomic potential in practice. For example, recently we have discussed that China does not have its own regional trade or economic bloc, like it is in case of the Russian Federation or in the United States that we discussed previously. China prefers to sign bilateral free trade agreements with neighboring countries, but it is not the same, and bilateral trade agreements do not contribute to economic power of China so much as the regional bloc could in theory. So we can conclude that though we have discussed a lot of geoeconomic instruments, geoeconomic advantages of China, its geoeconomic power in general, yet geoeconomic instruments that China can particularly use in order to strengthen its geopolitical power remain unclear for us. That's why we will discuss them a little bit later, meaning what is the current strategy or initiative or view of China, how to use its economic position, geoeconomic position and geoeconomic advantages, and to convert them into political advantages or strengthen itself geopolitically. We have briefly discussed the main geopolitical characteristics of China, its geopolitical location, its main geopolitical strengths and weaknesses. Now it's time to speak about historical shift of Chinese foreign policy thinking and to try to find their sort of geopolitical origins in this thinking. Let's very briefly remind ourselves the origins of geopolitical thinking. Geopolitical ideas go back to early history of humanity, and we can find a lot of impact of geopolitical factor on foreign policy of states and on relations between states. However, as an academic discipline, as an academic approach, geopolitics emerged only in the very late 19th and early 20th century in Europe. So geopolitics was developing around ideas of imperialism, later in the second half of the 20th century, Cold War containment geopolitics, and now around the concept of global multipolar competition. Some of these ideas that had their origins in Europe were later spread across the globe and were successfully implemented by some countries. We had example of Japan that used some geopolitical concepts in order to act in the region of East Asia. So now it is interesting for us how these ideas appeared in China, and if they appeared in China in the 20th century, or what role geopolitics or geopolitical factor played in foreign policy thinking of ancient China. And here we can find a very interesting thing. Throughout history of Chinese foreign policy, there was lack of geopolitical approach, lack of geopolitical thinking, especially if we compare Chinese foreign policy with foreign policy of many other European countries, or with foreign policy of Russia, or the Russian Empire, or the United States of America. Of course, Chinese emperor and statesmen historically did pay attention to some geographical factors, geopolitical factors. They tried to use geographical location of the country to secure itself or to expand its influence. However, Chinese foreign policy was less related to geopolitics in the European understanding, in the foreign policy behavior that tried to divide the world and to conquer new territories, to control states far beyond borders, and so on. Probably the only exception when Chinese foreign policy went far beyond its national borders was the so-called Zheng He's voyage. In the 15th century, Chinese Admiral Zheng He was sent by the Chinese emperor to explore new territories, new lands, and to establish relations with the new countries abroad. As you can see in this slide and in the map, this voyage was quite long, and Zheng He was quite successful in discovering new states, new lands, and even new continents. However, very soon, this voyage, when Zheng He came back, this voyage was forgotten in the country, and the further Chinese emperors, they did not pay the same attention to the other states and the other continents. They believed that, and this is the core principle, this was the core principle of Chinese foreign policy thinking, that China was already located in the middle of the world, the so-called Middle Kingdom, and therefore further and previous Chinese emperors did not care a lot about other lands and other states, and about any possibility for China to expand its influence and to control the other territories. So, in order to understand better contemporary Chinese geopolitical thinking, or how China views the world geopolitically, it is very important to understand this very old Chinese foreign policy thinking that was based on the principle that China was always a middle kingdom. In order to do this, we will ask one of our experts from Higher School of Economics, Professor Alexander Lukin. So let's continue our search for geopolitics and geoeconomics in Chinese foreign policy. As you see, China is a more complicated state than the United States and the Russian Federation were in the previous lectures. On the one hand, China has a huge economic capabilities and growing military power, and it goes without saying that it can be called economically and militarily one of the most powerful states in contemporary world. On the other hand, however, as we have just discussed, China did not have history of geopolitical planning. Its attitude to foreign policy and the style how it viewed the outside world was very distinct from the European or Euro-Atlantic practices that were in the European countries in early 20th century, in the United States, and even in the Russian Federation. On the other hand, however, even without a clear geopolitical planning, we should not forget that China lives in international geopolitical environment. And until all states, all great powers have something geopolitical in their minds, any activity of China will somehow interfere their geopolitical plans and therefore will look sort of geopolitical. And we can conclude that any new initiative of China, any new global initiative, global strategy, or any attempt of China to penetrate other regions, to establish close relations with states that are located in different regions or maybe in the sphere of influence of other great powers, would be perceived as a geopolitical act. So, when we are talking about geopolitics or geoeconomics in China, it is not only how China acts, but also how the outer world and how the other great powers perceive its actions. Probably the best way to analyze Chinese foreign policy and to look at it through the geopolitical or geoeconomical prism is to look at its biggest initiative, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. You can see it in this map. As you can see, the Belt and Road Initiative is a comprehensive policy or strategy or just initiative of China, which was aimed and still is aimed at development of relations between China and other countries in Eurasia, in Africa, and beyond. The second component is infrastructure. Obviously, it is not enough to have a partner with developing economy to trade with this partner. You also need sort of infrastructure to connect your country with another one, with your partner. And therefore, China invests a lot of money, is ready to invest a lot of money into building such an infrastructure on the ground, meaning railways, highways, and on the sea, meaning seaports. It is especially impressive if we look not only at the map of Eurasia, where China is ready to invest into railroads between its western regions and the European states, but also at Africa, at the African continent, where China is currently building a lot of railroads that go deep into the continent and provide infrastructure to deliver resources from Africa to Chinese companies. So the final component, which is the logical continuation of the first two, is trade. Chinese companies feel themselves really comfortable and competitive at the world level. They are ready to trade more with other countries, so China is ready to support them financially and through building infrastructure and through making them closer with their partners in other states and in other continents. It is worth mentioning that from the very beginning, Chinese leadership tried to avoid perception of the Belt and Road Initiative as a geopolitical one. Rather, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping characterized it as the one aimed at peaceful coexistence with the other countries and win-win cooperation, but definitely not the one related to outdated geopolitical maneuvering. Many scholars agreed with such an approach to the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of them, for example, pointed that there was no clear geographic plan within the Belt and Road Initiative, that China was just looking for new trade relations, trade partnership, trade ties with other countries across the globe, and it was ready to provide loans and build infrastructure in any country. It did not really matter for Chinese leadership whether this country was democratic or non-democratic, what was the type of political order in this country, culture, religion. China was looking for new trade opportunities. And partly we can agree that without such a geographic plan or geographic understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative, it was difficult to talk about geopolitics within this initiative, because we could hardly explain how it can contribute to Chinese power. The other scholars preferred to concentrate on the economic dimension on the Belt and Road Initiative and pointed that it is a purely geoeconomic project without any political or geopolitical dimension. Well, partly we can agree with these scholars, because indeed the Belt and Road Initiative is first of all about economic power of China and economic relations between China and the other countries. On the other hand, however, as we remember from one of the previous lectures, geoeconomics cannot exist without geopolitics. And therefore, if we're talking about geoeconomics within this, the Belt and Road Initiative, then we definitely can think about geopolitical logic within Chinese foreign policy. These and many other statements come from the Chinese feeling of vulnerability in its own region because of the presence here of many non-regional powers like the United States. And now the strategy of Belt and Road Initiative is aimed at reconstruction not only of China and its neighbors, but also at the whole Eurasian continent. Or, as you see here, China seeks not only to build a corridor through Asia, meaning that it is not only about economic relations between China and other countries and other regions, but to rebuild Asia itself, meaning to review, reconstruct relations in Eurasia and to make these relations more friendly and more profitable for China itself. Even without all these security issues that may play their role in the Chinese economic activity, we can use also critical geopolitics to conclude that Chinese foreign policy is not only what it is aimed at, but also how it is perceived by other countries. For example, here you see that China is like an adolescent who took too many steroids. It has suddenly become big, but it finds it hard to coordinate and control its body. What it means? On the one hand, China really does not do something special. It does not try to officially declare its geopolitical ambitions. It does not try to geopolitically influence the other states, continents, and regions. On the other hand, however, China has already become a very powerful country, one of the great powers, and for the other countries,
especially for the traditional geopolitical players, it is really hard to believe that such a powerful state does not have such geopolitical ambitions. So any step, any decision made by the Chinese leadership is very often perceived as the geopolitical one. We continue to discuss the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative together with Professor Maxim Bratersky from High School of Economics, who specializes in international political economy. Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello.
In one of our previous lectures, you pointed that China is among states that nowadays try to create alternative institutions in order to use their economic power geoeconomically, in order to maybe become more influential in some states, in some other states or regions, or at least to weaken its opponents or the other geopolitical powers. And this strategy, maybe we can say, goes side by side with the recent initiative, which is called the Belt and Road Initiative. Many people call it the Chinese geoeconomic strategy of going global. How would you comment this? What is your own opinion about both these strategies?
Well, there is such a strategy and there is a huge program behind it. Not all the details are clear yet because it's under constant development. But what is clear that China internationally invests huge sums into the construction of commercial and transportation infrastructure in the neighboring countries, linking China closer to other regions of the world. And together with this infrastructure, Chinese business, Chinese companies, Chinese technologists, Chinese engineers, workers, and sometimes Chinese military move to occupy stronger positions in the countries around. There is a simplified vision of this initiative. I've seen quite a few articles which basically say that what China is doing, they lend money to foreign governments for the purpose of building infrastructure. Later, when the governments are not able to repay the debt, Chinese sort of take these governments or take these countries under, if not control, but under strict management system, and insist on political moves and economic policies that will be favorable for the Chinese interests. While I cannot totally dismiss this, and in some cases we may observe something like that, I would insist that China has a different goal. We all know that China has been very successful with its economic reforms over the past already almost 50 years, 40 years, 50 years, and has grown from a very poor, very large and very poor country into an economic giant, which is challenging the US positions globally today. And together with that, China is changing its world outlook and its vision of itself in the world. If before China was happy being part of international value chains and trade infrastructure developed by the American and European corporations and having its modest share there, today China wants to be an owner itself. And what they do, and they have state programs of development aimed at this, what they do is they are rapidly developing global value chains centered in China. There are two aspects here, exactly what you're discussing, security and economic gain. Security aspect is that if a country is simply part of a value chain which belongs to somebody else, your economy is very vulnerable. If you stay somewhere in the center of the technological chain, your business can always be stopped. Spare parts will not be delivered to you, or credit will not be delivered to you, or on the other end, the final export market will be closed for you. And what will you do with these products, semi-manufactured products that nobody wants? So politically, it's a vulnerable position from the point of view of security. Economically, it's also not a very good position because this manufacturing process is the cheapest in the whole chain. Because who actually makes money? Those people who develop a product, who conceive a product, who do research and development, who market, who credit, who insure, who transport, who sell, who service. Yeah? So it is in the very beginning of the chain and at the very end of the chain. Those people with screwdrivers who are in the middle, they receive the tiniest part of the whole valley. So for these both reasons, China is not satisfied with this being in the middle anymore. They want to topple the value chains. And they are running the program of technological development, which is, according to their views, will put some of the Chinese corporations as global leaders providing global technological platforms. And this is exactly what stands in the center of the conflict with the United States. The United States do not want to allow anybody else to challenge these positions, and Chinese very confidently walk along this way.
China itself has already become so powerful or too powerful to use its economic power to pressure the other states as sort of geoeconomic instrument. And we discussed previously that the Belt and Road Initiative contains a lot of such geoeconomic instruments, like, for example, lending, providing loans to other countries, or building infrastructure in other countries, which is about investment, which is about also some sort of financial influence over these countries. So do you agree that we can speak about such geoeconomic instruments and the rising geoeconomic influence of China worldwide?
Yes, absolutely. All observers agree that Chinese political positions in Africa have improved dramatically because of the investment in Africa, for example. Chinese positions in authority and positions in Central Asia is also improving. But I would say that this policy and this size of the Chinese economy has also a negative effect. It's not only luring the neighbors to embrace the Chinese proposals, but also some countries fear the Chinese growing power and fear their infrastructural and financial aggression, if you wish.
Let's first speak about opportunities and instruments that China can successfully use. You mentioned Africa, but we also can say that the Belt and Road Initiative is rather global. It covers a lot of continents, a lot of states. Can we find there some geographical priorities for China, where China tries to concentrate its geoeconomic efforts on?
My impression is that Chinese efforts are focused in regions which are relatively vacant, which is Africa, which is Central Asia, and Chinese are very interested in participating in the development of the Northern Sea route, which is not there fully in place. Regardless of the Russian interest and presence there, it's not fully in place, so Chinese see a room to put their foot in. In the region of their neighbors in East Asia and Southeast Asia, Chinese, as I think, would want to behave the same way, but the opposition or the fear to the expansion is much higher there. Many of the neighbors have territorial issues with China. Many of the neighbors are scared with the perspective of further Chinese development, economic and military growth. And that is why I think the Chinese advances in the Southeast Asia are much more modest, because they are matched with much higher position than with countries which are far and which have less tense contacts with China. That is why I think though Chinese act globally, they're present in Latin America, they're present everywhere, but I think the most successful examples of their policies and the economic and political expansion are in Africa and Central Asia.
What about the region of the Middle East Shadow Belt? Is China ready to somehow geoeconomically compete there with local powers or with the United States?
I cannot tell you. On one hand, Chinese were doing all their best to oppose sanctions against Iran. Chinese buy important quantities of oil from this country. Chinese indirectly are present in the region. They are patrolling there. They are providing some training and some humanitarian aid to government of Syria. But they refrain from direct military participation. They are not part of the Syrian conflict or any other. And my feeling is that they would prefer to stay far from this really acute conflicts, not to get engaged in direct confrontation with other superpowers. Though indirectly they are running in some minor confrontations. The example is, for example, Chinese construction of network of automobile roads through Kashmir, through Pakistan. Pakistan is an old friend of China and welcomes such a construction, but India, which has its own views on what Kashmir is and to whom it belongs to, opposes Chinese initiative very strongly.
And by the way, we know about huge Chinese investment into economy of Venezuela, despite the fact that regime in this American country is not favorable for the United States. The U.S. administration of every president didn't like. First of all, first President Hugo Chavez, now the next president, Nicolas Maduro. However, China continues to invest money in the sphere of oil extraction.
Chinese are becoming stronger and their self-perception is changing. Say 15, 20 years ago, we wouldn't expect any active foreign policy or economic policy from China because China was at that moment seeing herself as minor, as a student who was learning from others how to trade, how to manufacture, how to behave. But with time, Chinese policies are changing. I cannot say they're becoming more assertive, but they would already take some risks, which they wouldn't have taken, say, 10 years before.
You mentioned complicated relations between China and its neighbors, especially in East and Southeast Asia. What about relations between China and the Russian Federation? We know that there is a sort of economic cooperation or even economic partnership between China and the Russia-led Eurasian Economic Union. Was there sort of geopolitical logic in this economic partnership?
Yes, there is. I'm not sure we can talk really about our partnership between China and the Eurasian Economic Union. Yes, we all remember the joint declaration by Putin and Xi Jinping in 2015 about compatibility of Chinese project of One Belt, One Road and Eurasian Economic Union. But even today, it's a big mystery to me what did they mean. But what is happening is a growing bilateral trade. China increases its trade with all countries of Central Asia, and with Russia, the trade is growing very quickly. It exceeds $100 billion already a year, which is a record. In that sense, moreover, our relations are not limited to trade only. If you noticed a couple of days, and we are talking in July now, a couple of days ago, there was information about joint patrolling by Russian and Chinese bombers over the Chinese Sea, which is absolutely unprecedented thing. It's not a military alliance, of course, but such things may take place only between countries which really trust each other. At the same time, in Russia, still there is a number of people who are skeptical, who are scared, who talking about the Chinese expansion, threat, claims on the Russian territory, infiltration of Chinese immigrants. To my view, these fears are over-exaggerated, but at the same time it will be unreasonable and irresponsible to take everything for granted and not to look out for possible challenges.
Can we say that these economic relations, good economic relations between China and the Russian Federation contribute to the overall friendly relations between the two countries, and by this contribute to security and geopolitical security of China in the northern and in the western borders?
Absolutely. Both countries gain in terms of security from this partnership very much. Look, China, main vector of Chinese naval expansion is Southeast Asia, but there this expansion is restricted by the US Navy. And in case, God save us, but in case of some conflict between United States and China, which cannot be ruled out, US Navy is still much more powerful, and it will probably interrupt Chinese sea trade at all. Mm-hmm. And China will not be able to receive anything by sea. That is why strategically, in terms of security, China is enormously interested in having a reliable rear. Central Asia and Russia with its resources, which can supply resources by land to China even in such situations, because you cannot interrupt land communications. Russia also gains. Skeptics are saying that the terms of Russian, say, gas or oil contracts with China are not the best, that China uses relative Russian weakness in difficult circumstances because of sanctions on Russia. Partially it is true, but nobody wants to talk about such a thing. And imagine American administration succeeds, and succeeds fully, maybe not with this president, but with the next president, and all Russian gas export to Europe stops. What Russia is supposed to do with its gas? Because until recently, Russia didn't have an alternative. Now there is an alternative. You know, we have another partner, we have another buyer. And even if we don't look in these apocalyptic scenarios, we are simply in a better bargaining positions, because Europeans knew that we had no choice. And now they have that we now have a choice.
Let's return for the moment to the global picture. In one of the previous parts, I mentioned that maybe the current Chinese leadership does not have in their minds geopolitical logic of their activity, meaning the Belt and Road Initiative. But the fact how a Belt and Road Initiative is implemented means that many countries in Africa, in the Middle East, maybe in other regions, may start to reorient the economies and therefore their foreign policy from cooperation with, in broad sense, Western countries to closer cooperation with China, and therefore the global geopolitical picture may change even if China doesn't want this. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I agree with this. It is what is exactly happening. One should not expect any overnight revolutions in that sense, but everything is relative. Yeah, the influence of Western powers and the United States maybe is not decreasing, but is not growing.
So fast as the Chinese one.
So fast as the Chinese one. That is why the balance is gradually changing.
So ultimately, we can say that even despite the fact that China did not have this geopolitical tradition in its history of foreign policy, the current Chinese foreign policy contains this component of geopolitics. And in terms of regional priorities and regional foreign policy for China, it is more about geopolitics, more about security, more about having good relations with neighbors and ensuring its possibilities to trade worldwide. At the global level, however, China does not try to act geopolitically and tries to avoid confrontation with other great powers. It does not try, for example, to penetrate aggressively such regions as post-Soviet space or
the European Union, the European region, or maybe Latin America, the traditional spheres of influence of other geopolitical powers. It tries to concentrate mainly on the regions that were not economically occupied, if we can say like this, but by these geopolitical powers. But in general, Chinese economic activity, geoeconomic activity worldwide, brings it to closer geopolitical competition with the traditional powers, and this competition will rise in the next years. It looks like China is a very complicated geopolitical case. On the one hand, China definitely has some regional geopolitical goals, geopolitical priorities regarding its security. On the other hand, worldwide, being a very economically powerful country, China does not have and never had geopolitical thinking. It prefers to concentrate on economic achievements, on trading and signing new trade agreements with other countries, on constructing new infrastructure according to its initiative Belt and Road. But it is really hard to find the geopolitical dimension and the geopolitical logic in all these actions. In order to do this, I decided to invite Professor Dmitry Suslov from High School of Economics, who specializes on global security issues and global governments. Good afternoon, Professor Suslov.
My pleasure.
In the previous parts, we concluded that despite the fact that Chinese foreign policy is very economic-based and China, within its Belt and Road Initiative, is looking for economic cooperation and economic ties with other countries, this activity of China changes geopolitical landscape. China, despite being an economic power, exists and lives in geopolitical environment, and even without such goals or without such geopolitical wishes, it acts geopolitically even if it doesn't want so. Could you please tell us your opinion regarding Chinese geopolitics and maybe give us some information or your own opinion about Chinese geopolitical priorities or vision, less regionally but more global?
Well, first, I agree with you that the very fact of the Chinese profound rise and the Chinese geoeconomic expansionism all over the world, it has very important repercussions for the global geopolitics. China, although China does not position itself as a geopolitical power, as a rival power, China is regarded so by the United States. The very fact that China has become so powerful economically and so widely present in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, it triggers concerns, it triggers fears in the United States, in Europe, in the Chinese neighborhood, and they start, almost instinctive policy of containment of China, and this fundamentally changes the global geopolitical context because now we live in the world of returned great power confrontation, great power rivalry, and the major axis of this confrontation is between the US and China. So the implication of Chinese rise and Chinese penetration into the other regions is the start of the US-Chinese confrontation, of the West-Chinese confrontation, because it includes Europeans also, which compels China to react. And as China reacts to this confrontation, because it cannot refuse to participate in it, right? The American policy of confrontation with China is very comprehensive and is very painful. The US uses economic instruments, trade war, technological instruments, sanctions against ZTE, Huawei, restricting the Chinese technological development. It includes political dimension. The US compels that other countries do not, establish cooperative relations with China, do not join One Belt, One Road, and so on and so forth. And military dimension, the increase of the US military presence, including nuclear presence in Asia Pacific. The major reason why the US withdrew from the INF Treaty, which prohibited intermediate range ballistic missiles, is China, because the US wants to pressure China more with the military presence in East Asia and wants to untie its hands in terms of the military pressure, arms race pressure vis-a-vis China. So China needs to react to that, and this, I think, drives the Chinese geopolitical actions and also geopolitical thinking. So so Chinese geopolitics, I think, emerges despite its initial preference and designs, as you originally said. So I would cite, I think, two major dimensions of the Chinese, this geopolitical partly thinking but predominantly actions. First, it's still the region. China does have a political purpose, not just economic purpose. Economic purpose is, of course, development and prosperity. But political purpose of China is to overcome the century of humiliation. Because China thinks that it was humiliated from second half of from late 19th century, the Opium Wars, up to late 20th century. China wants to overcome it and restore the rightful place of China in the region and in the world. And this rightful place is the Asian hegemony. Because historically, China considered itself as the heaven, as the empire under heaven, the central empire. It had hegemonic types of hub and spoke relations with the regional barbarians or with the subordinated countries in the region, even if they were not subordinated to China, but China still regarded them as subordinate. China wants to restore that. So China wants to be respected in the world as the great power, as a legitimate great power, to be respected in this regard. And China wants to restore hegemony in the region. Restoration of the Chinese hegemony in the region requires the decrease of the role of the United States in the region, in Asia Pacific. And this is why the American-Chinese relations will become so, they are already so confrontational and will become even more confrontational in the future. China wants to overcome the encirclement from the Pacific, which now takes place because of the American system of allies and partners. Japan, Korea, some Southeast Asian countries, and so on and so forth.
Could you please provide us sort of ranking of these geopolitical priorities for China in its eastern part in the Asia Pacific?
Yes, I think the major immediate priority is, of course, Taiwan. Because this is the part of China, basically, and China wants to re-establish control over Taiwan. Secondly, it is South China Sea, which China regards as the China-centric or nearly China-dominated region. Third, it is undermining American presence in East Asia and Southeast Asia in general, and preventing the capacity of the United States to block Chinese systems of communications, Chinese trade, which passes the systems of islands in the Pacific and thus makes China vulnerable. So from East Asia, China wants friendly environment, friendly encirclement, but also to restore the natural historical state of affairs, which is China-centric, the Chinese hegemony over other East Asian countries. I would say that the restoration of the Chinese centrism in East Asia is the final, the maximum purpose, but the immediate purpose is Taiwan.
What is the geopolitical role here of relations between China with the Russian Federation?
Very important, because Russia is regarded by China as a safe rear. China faces confrontation and the intensification of confrontation from the Pacific. The United States are trying, to lock China there, to contain China there. And the major geopolitical nightmare for China is to be surrounded by unfriendly powers from all sides. And this requires partnership and good relations between China and Russia. Partnership with Russia guarantees that China will not be encircled, that China has a friendly power in the West, in the Northwest, which is Russia. And Russia is for China the only real, sincere, friendly neighbor and the only real friendly great power. Because what other great powers are friendly of China? I would say none. The US is adversary. India is a rival. Brazil doesn't really care. So only Russia is the only truly friendly great power vis-a-vis China,
or at least not competing,
or at least not a competitor, not a rival, and not an adversary. And I think China values that. So it is even wrong to say who benefits and who is interested more in the Russian-Chinese partnership, Russia or China. I think both are interested in the preservation of this partnership. And this is why I think it is not likely that the Russian-Chinese relations will deteriorate in the future.
Let's come back for a moment to the global level.
Yep.
We've mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, that China invests a lot of money abroad. It constructs new seaports, new infrastructure, railways, highways, in order to deliver resources. It invests into resource mining industries in the other regions, in the Middle East, in Africa. And if I understand you correctly, even if China does not want to confront the geopolitical interests of other countries in these regions, it does so. And potentially, or maybe even now, Chinese leadership starts to understand that in order to continue this geoeconomic activity, or in order to continue development of this Belt and Road Initiative, China needs power, military power, power at large, to secure its initiative.
Of course. You know, first, China has become very much dependent on its economic penetration into the other regions. China needs trade, investment with Africa, with Middle Eastern countries, with Latin America in order to continue high growth rates in China itself. And this is a huge source of vulnerability. So China needs to make sure that its lines of communication, its relations with those countries are protected. And this requires the build-up, as you rightly said, of the military component of Chinese power.
How successful is China in this sphere?
China is starting to do it. You know, it is not historically typical of China, because historically China was, of course, the empire and great power and hegemon in East Asia. But China didn't have the outreach to other regions. China isolationism was the Chinese pattern of foreign policy, not expansionism, not global expansionism. Now, for the first time in its history, China requires military expansionism and political and geopolitical expansionism because of the Chinese economic model, because China is very much dependent on economic relations with the outside world. This is why, for the first time in its history, China has already built a military base very far from the Chinese shores, which is in Djibouti. And probably China will increase its number of military bases, its military presence in the world, again, in order to secure its economic channels of communication. But doing so, China becomes a geopolitical player. You know, China changes geopolitics because the basis Djibouti is about geopolitics, right? China is
a
becoming,
choke point.
It is a checkpoint. Yeah, China is becoming the military and geopolitical actor in the worldwide. And this pushes China, compels China to start thinking geopolitically, not just economically, but geopolitically. And another argument, you know, China is penetrating many other regions. These regions are, not undiscovered lands, right? These regions were already under someone else's control, or these regions already have others' interests involved.
Even in Africa.
Even in Africa, Africa in particular. You know, Africa was the continent that was historically dominated by European countries, then the United States, partly also Soviet Union, but Soviet Union disappeared after it collapsed. But when China comes to Africa, it certainly challenges the interests of United States and European countries. And this also triggers geopolitical rivalry, geopolitical confrontation. This is why we have the emergence and intensification of geopolitical struggle between China and European countries in other continents and in other regions.
Let me ask you one more question. couple months ago, in 2019, one of US states officials pointed that the competition between the United States and China that is to come, that everyone expects to appear, will be more intensive and more dangerous than the past competition, geopolitical rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it was explained like that the Soviet Union was a Christian state. Here is a sort of civilizational explanation, that it was still a confrontation between two Christian states, while in case of possible US-China confrontation, it is a very huge and deep civilizational aspect. Two different civilizations are to compete with each other geopolitically.
Well, first, I agree with the proposition of intensity and durability of this confrontation, but not because of Chinese civilizational aspects, but because of economic aspects. China seems to be more sustainable and successful economically than was the Soviet Union. And this is why it will be simply more difficult for the United States to prevail over China in the cause of the new American-Chinese confrontation. As for the civilizational aspect, I think the statement that you mentioned explains the fear of uncertainty. The United States have never faced a rival, a peer competitor from the other civilization, and they don't know how this actor will behave. There are two schools of thought, basically, among the global scholarship, including American scholarship, about how might China behave. And one school of thought actually profoundly disagrees with that statement and claims that because China is a different civilization, because it is a non-Christian civilization, because they have a specific strategic thinking, because they have the history and tradition of isolationism, not expansionism. After all, in order to deal with the northern barbarians, China built the Great Wall, right? It didn't try to conquer and dominate all the barbarians than some other countries tried to do. Russia expanded in order to get security. China was building walls, right? So you see that's a different strategic culture. And since China has different strategic culture, this school of thought claims it is not necessarily. It is rather unlikely that China will replicate the policies of previous great powers and superpowers, including the Soviet Union and the United States, as China becomes powerful. So it is wrong from the perception of this school of thought to assume that when China becomes a real superpower, it will build a China-centric international order. It will try to expand and export Chinese values, China-centric institutions, China rules, the things that the Soviet Union and the United States did, and what the United States is doing by now. There will be some different form of Chinese participation in the international system, even when China is the country number one in the world. So it will not be a global Pax Sinica, right, as a descendant of Pax Britannica or Pax Americana. Whereas the other school of thought claims that since China is different, it might behave even in a more dangerous way, or even in a more expansionist way than the previous hegemons, including the United States of America. And by the way, there is a third school of thought, which is realism, offensive realism in this case, championed by John Mearsheimer, American scholar, who claims that strategic culture and civilizational aspects doesn't matter, and basically all powers behave in a similar way. Every single country wants to be a hegemon, despite its religion, despite its identity, despite its history, and thus China will likely replicate the behavior of the United States and previous hegemons. Which school of thought is true, we simply don't know, yes. But it will be very interesting to observe the future development of Chinese foreign policy and the Chinese-American competition.
So we can say that geopolitics in China is currently emerging, and the word uncertainty, I think the key word here. The only thing that we are certain about is that geopolitics is somewhere here ready to be born in China, and the history tells us that it is really possible. We have the example of Japan in the first half of the 20th century, which originally wasn't a Western state, but that imported and incorporated many ideas from Europe, many European thoughts, including geopolitics and including geopolitical logic of foreign policy. Whether it will become in China or not, or if yes, then how it will look, we will see in the next years. Thank you, Professor Suslov.
My pleasure.
Hello, and welcome back to our final lecture. Today we're going to summarize everything that we have learned previously and to discuss how we can use all this knowledge, all these theories that we have discussed, and the geopolitical approach that we have tried in cases of the United States, Russia, and China. Despite the fact some scholars criticize geopolitics for paying little attention to quantitative methods and for using only qualitative methods, geopolitics continues to contribute to our understanding of international relations, of relations between countries, and of foreign policy of particular states. Geopolitics occupies a perfect balance between simplification and description of reality. On the one hand, geopolitics, as many other international relations theories, simplifies our world and, through this simplified model, explains how relations between states work. On the other hand, geopolitics contains this geographic part and geographical background, which is the most permanent in international relations. Altogether, these two factors form a perfect lens to look at international relations. The first and the most obvious way how we can use this lens is for foreign policy decisions. Historically, scientists and politicians used geopolitics to explain the world around themselves and to determine main foreign policy priorities for their countries. They understood that states could not escape geography. Their location was predetermined, they had particular location, they had particular neighbors with whom they were supposed to deal with. So scientists and scholars used geopolitical approach and continue to use it to determine threats and challenges that states face, vulnerable points of their location and borderlines, to determine their allies and enemies in the world arena. They also learned how to use geography, meaning size of a country, its resources, geographic location or relative location, meaning its neighbors, to maximize profit, to maximize security of the country. And they also used the geopolitical approach and continue to use it to understand what the other states think about their own foreign policy and what is the other state's geopolitics. For this, they usually looked at both classical and critical geopolitics. Even today, geopolitics is widely used not only within foreign policy decision-making process, but also by many think tanks and by some journalists that tried, or experts that try to advise those people who are directly involved in the foreign policy decision-making process in the governments of the countries. And of course, as long as many universities are deeply involved in foreign policy advising, geopolitics also finds its place among other courses related to foreign policy making in bachelor and master's program. Students also learn geopolitics here not only to explain contemporary relations between states and contemporary geopolitical factor within these relations, but also to understand better historical background of current foreign policy of the country, its current geopolitics, and contemporary contradictions between some states. The academic sphere and the sphere of foreign policy advising are the two ones that are already familiar to us. However, relevance of geopolitics goes far beyond these two spheres. For example, it is becoming more and more important for business. In the year 2017, in the magazine Financial Times, there was an article called "Why Geopolitics is Finding a Place on the Business School Map," related to the fact that geopolitical courses are becoming more and more popular in the MBA programs of many universities. The main idea of this article is that business activity of national and international companies is performed in geopolitical reality. Among such geopolitical events mentioned in the article are Catalan independence from Spain, that was especially relevant in the year 2017, intention of President Donald Trump to pull out the United States from the NAFTA free trade agreement, and also intentions of Britain to leave the European Union. Ultimately, all these geopolitical events made the world increasingly uncertain place and shaped the environment in which businesses operate. So the main outcome of this influence of geopolitical events on business activity of companies is that geopolitics is worth studied not only within its traditional fields like history, international relations and foreign policy making, but also by students from other programs like management or international economics. As it is said in the article, the business school world is realizing that unless we are very much involved in the mega trends which are affecting civil society around the world, we are not going to make our students relevant to what the companies need them to be. And as long as we remember that traditional geopolitics is not only about security issues, but also about economic activity of states and economic relations between countries, geoeconomic factors also contribute to business activity of companies. We can give examples of economic restrictions for business activity because of geopolitical reasons, such as sanctions, as well as economic pressure from one state on business activity in other states. One of the good examples here is the one discussed previously in one of our lectures about Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline going from the Russian Federation to the European countries, and the pressure that is made by the United States, the US Congress, on the European countries, threatening to sanction some of their national companies that cooperate with the Russian Gazprom. Another example is economic support for business from the state in strategic areas. And another relevant example here is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where the Chinese government is ready to provide sort of economic assistance and support to its national companies that work within this big project. Because a state successfully returned to the international arena after a short period of a unipolarity moment and the so-called end of history, and because the geopolitical competition between countries also came back, geopolitical factors influence not only activity of businesses, but also geopolitics is becoming more relevant for investors. Because of geopolitical events and usage of some geoeconomic instruments, economic growth of a particular state may increase or slow down. There is also an impact of geopolitics and geopolitical events on national currency of many countries. We should also mention a huge role of geopolitics in unpredictability of resource prices. A very good example here is oil prices and the Middle East shadow belt, where a lot of oil extracting countries are located. And any geopolitical tensions in this region may increase oil prices dramatically, as it was several times in the history. And the last but not the least, the influence of geopolitics on market stocks, where stocks of companies from particular countries and of these countries themselves are usually sold. After the end of the Cold War, during 1990s and even in the very early 2000s, it wasn't obvious that geopolitics was worth studied and was necessary for everyone. However, according to DOTS 2007, after terrorist attacks against the United States in 2001, as well as due to some other terrorist attacks in other cities like Bali, Casablanca, Istanbul, Jerusalem, London and Madrid in 2000s, it became clear how peoples of one country and even one part of the world are very interconnected with peoples in another part of the globe. All this brings us to the conclusion that it is not only states that cannot escape geography and continue to be located in the places where they appeared, but also the peoples and nations that continue to live where they emerged, to continue to live in the states where they emerged. Therefore, geopolitics is not an elite field of science anymore. It influences our everyday life, and therefore it is relevant for everyone to be a geopolitician. It is smart to be a geopolitician. Luckily, we have access to tons of information to be geopoliticians. Speeches, official documents, journalist articles and experts' comments, data and statistics. All we need is the skill to correctly interpret all this information with the help of geopolitics. Okay, now let's summarize everything that we have learned about geopolitics. First of all, we remember that there is no widely accepted definition of what is geopolitics. In a broad sense, we can say that geopolitics is a subfield of international relations that studies how factors of geography, all of these factors, different various factors of geography, influence foreign policy behavior of a particular state. But geopolitics is not only about these factors of geography and one single state. As we remember, states do not live in vacuum. They are surrounded by other states, they need to cooperate or communicate with these states, they have relations with these states, and one of the basic assumptions of geopolitics, as well as of some other international relations theories like realism, is that no absolute gains in international politics are available. And states always compete for these gains, states compete for resources, states compete for power, and therefore we study not only factor of geography in foreign policy of a particular state, but also factor of geography in this competition between states over resources, power, and security. Ultimately, we can say that there are two main objectives of this geopolitical competition: power and security. Power in broad sense, it does not only include military power, but also resources and the ability to project this power in a particular place, so it is a very complex variable. And security, which is about protection of what you already have in your state. From the late 19th and early 20th century, from the time when geopolitical knowledge first emerged, it wasn't a single theory that tried to explain everything in international relations. It always was a combination of different theories, different approaches, developed by academics within the academic community and also by political practitioners. First, let's discuss these theories. Some of these theories tried to find the nature and rules of competition in geographic distribution of resources, living space, lines of communication, something that we remember from heartland and rimland, from competition between the sea power and the land power, competition between great powers over resources, over control over trade routes, and so on. From the late 19th and early 20th century, from the times when geopolitical knowledge first emerged, geopolitics never was a single theory that was able to explain all aspects of international relations. Rather, it was a number of theories, a combination of theories and approaches developed within the academic community and by political practitioners. Some of them focused on objective reality and tried to find the nature and rational rules of competition between states in geographic distribution of resources that these states were looking for, geographic distribution of living space on the earth, lines of communication, meaning trade routes that were always one of sources of wealth and power for these countries, and so on. Other scientists, however, prefer to look not on objective reality, but rather on minds and preferences of decision makers, on culture and traditions of states and peoples. This approach is known to us as critical geopolitics, and it considered geopolitics as a product of the age of imperialism, then as a product of the bipolar competition during the Cold War, and geopolitics as knowledge was always studied within a certain historical context. Another group of scholars and politicians that prefer to focus on practical issues of geopolitical competition between states prefer to concentrate on instruments of this competition. For example, military and power projection, resources and infrastructure, something that is studied within classical geopolitics. And the recent focus within the recent 2 or 3 decades, the economic issues like economy itself, trade and various agreements and blocks between countries, business activity, in other words, how all these economic aspects influence on geopolitics and what is their role within geopolitical competition. This approach is known to us as geoeconomics. As long as geopolitical knowledge is a product of activity of both academic community and political practitioners, we can speak about 2 main goals. On the one hand, when we consider geopolitics as a scientific subfield of international relations, we usually say that its main aim is to explain how the competition between countries happens and try to predict role of states today and in the future, or not of states but also of particular places on the planet, in this competition, and what role these places or some other geographic factors can play in the competition between countries. And as we remember, to do this in a best way, we should combine all 3 approaches: the classical geopolitics, which is about military power and security issues, the critical approach, which is about studying preferences and views of decision makers and of peoples within a country, and the geoeconomic approach, which is the most recent one, to learn and to study economic instruments of geopolitical competition. While scholars focus on explanation of how things work and try to predict how these things will work in the future, political practitioners developed something that we call geostrategy. Geopolitics is about how geographic factors influence politics among nations. Geostrategy is how a particular country can consider or should consider all these geopolitical factors to develop its own strategy and attitude to its neighbors, to the other countries that it competes with, and so on. We remember that geopolitics is first of all about global competition. We can find this in the very term geopolitics, where geo historically meant Earth, so the whole planet. And geopolitics that emerged in the age of imperialism was about global competition between great powers who had global interests and global capabilities. However, to learn the situation in a best way, we should also consider and look deeper into many regional issues that sometimes we ignore when we look at competition between the great powers at the global level. And therefore, the regional level of geopolitics is also very important. The only difference is the following, that at the global level we consider interests and influence and power of all main geopolitical players. At the regional level, we look at interests and capabilities of main regional powers, but also we should consider interests of global powers that have their own interests in a particular region and that may consider this region as a tool of competition or a place of competition with other great powers. What are these factors? First of all, one of the first historical factors was resources and their significance for power and security of the country. We know a lot of examples of military conflicts since very ancient times when one state decided to possess resources that belonged to another state, and that led to military conflict between them. Another factor, also historical factor, was lines of communication. Lines of communication provided opportunity for states to exchange products, to arrange trade, to redistribute resources, and obviously the country that controlled these lines of communication, had influence over them, or was really close to these lines, had certain gains. And every time when, due to technological development, these lines of communication changed, some states lost their wealth and power, and other states had a chance to gain more. What are these factors? One of the first historically known factor was resources and their significance for power and security of the country. We know a lot of historical examples since very ancient times when one country decided to start a war with another one in order to establish control over a certain type of resource. And with the time when significance of these resources changed, military conflicts between different countries always also changed. For example, several centuries ago, nobody really tried to establish control over the Middle East states, but in the early 20s and especially in the middle of the 20th century, these states became very important because of energy resources there. Another factor, also historical one, is lines of communication. There are different types of these lines: sea routes, land routes, railways, highways, and pipelines. All these lines of communication allow states to exchange resources, to redistribute products, and to arrange trade at large. And therefore, a country that controls lines of communication or has influence over them, or is rather close to these lines, has certain benefits that it can convert into power. Every time, therefore, when these lines of communication change, some countries may lose their resources and other countries can find more gains and become more powerful. Because some resources become more or less significant, and because some lines of communication disappear or new lines emerge, we can conclude that always there are new states that appear in the global geopolitical competition. And therefore, with emergence of these new powers, the whole geopolitical picture of the world map also changes. Finally, societies and peoples of which every state consists are not static. They change, they develop, new ideologies, religions, traditions usually appear, and these new characteristics of societies may also influence on how state views itself and the surrounding world in the worldwide geopolitical competition. It is something that happened in the age of imperialism when geopolitics emerged. Later, it also happened during the Cold War between the USSR and the United States, when the global context influenced the perception of the world in many countries worldwide. And it is something that happens right now, and that says that approaches to geopolitics may vary even in a single country throughout its history. Now let's discuss the main sources of geopolitical knowledge. Partly we have looked at some of them very briefly. However, there is a very huge massive of geopolitical literature that one should definitely read, or at least look through and be aware of what is written there. To begin with, we should obviously mention the two scholars that contributed to the very emergence of geopolitics. The first one is Alfred Machen, who wrote about historical context of a competition between countries and the role of naval power in this competition, the role of naval power that was used by some countries to establish control over trade routes, which, according to Machen, were the main source of wealth and power of nations. We can read and find all this information in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The second scholar is well known to us, Halford Mackinder, the founding father of geopolitics, who wrote a lot about factors of geography in power and competition. And his first publication that we should look at is The Geographical Pivot of History. There he wrote about various variables that influenced international competition between countries, including geography, including different factors that changed this perception of geography in international relations, like technological development. He first mentioned the competition between the sea power and land power, and he developed the concept heartland as well. He developed many of these ideas in his further publications. For example, Democratic Ideals and Reality, a study in the politics and reconstruction, which is dedicated to many more geographic factors and their role in international politics in various regions. And finally, we can look at evolution of his thought and of his views at geopolitical competition between countries in one of his latest publications, The Round World and the Winning of the Peace, published in 1943. With the emergence of separated field of science, international relations, one of the main goals was to incorporate geographic knowledge as a study of natural sources of behavior of states into a more social field of international relations. And this goal was successfully achieved by realists like Nicholas Spykman and Hans Morgenthau, who considered many geographical factors in their realist theories, in their realist approach to international relations. We should here especially focus on Nicholas Spykman and his publications like The Geography of the Peace, where he reconsidered the Mackintosh theory of heartland and developed his own concept, the concept of riverland and its role in the history of international relations. And there is a number of his articles in the American Political Science Review journal, which are also very useful, where Nicholas Spykman tells us a lot about how different geographic factors may, but not necessarily do, influence foreign policy of states and relations between countries, geography and foreign policy, and geographic objectives in foreign policy. Every student who wants to deal with international relations and to study geopolitics and competition among states should pay attention to these three names: Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Saul Cohen. The two political practitioners contributed a lot to development of geopolitics and geopolitical approach. Among books of Henry Kissinger, I would first of all recommend Diplomacy and World Order, where he incorporates geopolitical thought into his understanding of equilibrium in international relations and how geopolitics contribute to stability of world order in the global competition. The second author is highly recommended to everyone who wants to understand better the American foreign policy and the current priorities of the United States. Zbigniew Brzezinski and his book The Grand Chessboard is about what are the geopolitical priorities for any American president and on what regions and what countries the United States should concentrate their efforts. Another book of many written by Zbigniew Brzezinski is The Choice: Global Domination or Global Leadership. If you remember, it was one of the fundamental questions in early 2000s. Even we can call it a geopolitical question. What is the geopolitical role of the United States in the community of Western powers? Whether it wants to be a global power that dominates the whole world, or whether it should rather become a leader of the Western world and to continue geopolitical competition with all other revisionist or rising powers. The main contribution of Saul Cohen to geopolitical studies is that he was among the first who decided to look at regional level of geopolitical competition and divided the whole world into different geopolitical regions. We remember his map that we discussed in our lecture number 5. And so, in order to understand better the logic of this division and the peculiarities of geopolitical competition in every single region on the Earth, I would recommend you to read his book, Geopolitics, the Geography of International Relations, where he gives you not only the historical development of geopolitical knowledge, but also explains this distribution of geopolitical regions and gives the key players in each of them. The book by Robert Kaplan, The Revenge of Geography, is dedicated to 1990s and early 2000s, the period that we called the moment of unipolarity, when there was no widely accepted understanding of what happened in international relations, and when a lot of scholars believed that a new era, the end of history, had started. According to Robert Kaplan, and this is something that he writes in his book, geography as a fundamental factor of international relations did not disappear with the end of the Cold War. And he gives a lot of examples in Europe, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, how the geographic factors continue to influence regional tensions and competition at the regional and at the global level. Finally, If you like geopolitics like I, and if you want to look deeper into methodology of geopolitical knowledge and what theories and we can use in analyzing international relations and how we can use them more precisely, you can read the book by Phil Kelly, Classical Geopolitics, a New Analytical Model, where the author provides a very good analysis and compares geopolitics as an approach to study international relations with a number of other approaches. Now let's move to critical geopolitics, and here I recommend the book Critical Geopolitics, The Politics of Right in Global Space by one of the founders of this subfield of geopolitics, Gerard O'Toole. I can also recommend a number of contemporary authors that write a lot of books and articles dedicated to critical approach in geopolitics, like John Agnew, Klaus Dodds, and Simon Dalby. What is very important that we can use critical geopolitics and books written by critical geopoliticians not only to understand how to study international relations, but also to look through many documents and many speeches in the recent decades and centuries that were very important for geopolitical competition of the past. That is why I can also recommend you to read various geopolitical readers. I give you the examples of only two here in this slide, where we can find a number of very useful doctrines, articles written by different politicians or by academic scholars that contributed to practical geopolitics in those times. Like the Truman Doctrine, for example, the Brezhnev Doctrine, Mikhail Gorbachev's article, The New Political Thinking, and many more. Don't forget that being a critical geopolitician means that you should also read all these speeches and documents on your own. Not only to try find them in books, in readers of geopolitics, but also to open websites, to listen to speeches, to analyze these speeches, and to be able to interpret what you have heard into geopolitical explanation of behavior of a particular state. The best way to learn geoeconomics is to start reading the article by its founding father, Edward Luttwak, From Geopolitics to Geoeconomics, Logic of Conflict, Grammar of Commerce. In this article, the author explains what is geoeconomics and how it is connected with geopolitics, and what is the difference between geoeconomics as an approach and international economy. Then you can look through the book War by Other Means, Geoeconomics and Statecraft, where the authors provide us with knowledge about the new economic instruments of geopolitical competition. Another book is Geoeconomics and Power Politics in the 21st Century, where we can find information about different varieties of these instruments and of economic power in particular states, especially with focus on great powers, but also on some regional leaders like India and European countries and the European Union itself. Finally, in the lecture I mentioned that geoeconomics gives not only opportunities for countries to influence economically the other states, but also creates certain interdependence between these countries. In order to understand the geopolitical significance of this interdependence, the role of different institutions and how states can use these institutions to achieve geopolitical goals, the book Connectivity Wars is also recommended. All these books are dedicated to global or regional competition between countries. We can find there some national characteristics of states' geopolitics. However, if you're looking for separately national geopolitics of a particular country, here's the formula what you should read and what you should look for to study geopolitics of a particular country. You should first start with readings in history of national geopolitical thought, or of history of foreign policy of a country, if there wasn't such a history of geopolitical thought, like it was in China that we discussed in the previous lecture. Then a good idea is to look through modern official documents, speeches and statements to know the context and the views of current leadership of the country, their attitude to geopolitical problems, geopolitical challenges that their country faces. Another good idea is to read the other opinions of other scholars or practitioners, to know the other angles of view on geopolitics of this particular country. You can start with speeches or comments of experts and practitioners that usually still work in councils on foreign relations, which exist in every big country or great power. Please also pay attention to academic articles and comments of academic experts that you can find in various journals dedicated to international relations and especially to geopolitics. There is even a special journal called Geopolitics, or another one is Eurasian Geography and Economics, that concentrate on the factor of geography in political relations between countries. Finally, if you are looking for the most recent comments and the most recent studies, the best way is to search for them in online sources. For example, in regularly updated websites where there is a regular analysis of all these issues and of national geopolitics of states. In the United States, there is a website, Stratfor, which is dedicated to this topic. In the Russian Federation, we can name, among others, the Valdai Discussion Club. And finally, if you want to estimate power or power capabilities of power projection of a particular country, don't forget to look for data and statistics in various sources, in different organizations that is published and available worldwide. In the previous 3 lectures, we discussed the 3 cases of states that are involved into geopolitical competition at the global level and that have global geopolitical or geoeconomic capabilities. However, as we remember, geopolitics is much more complicated and includes many more states than just these 3 examples. In order to follow all events that happen in international relations and international politics, one should regularly consider geopolitical competition, should do geoeconomic analysis, should use critical geopolitics, and should also follow the main trends that happen in geopolitics that tell us about new players, new instruments, and new rules of this competition. When we look at geopolitical map of the world, we usually start with the 3 main players, which are the United States, the Russian Federation, and the People's Republic of China. However, we remember that more and more countries are becoming involved into this competition because of power shift that is happening right now from the West to the East. More and more states today are becoming economically stronger in different regions of the world outside the Western sphere of influence. There are new areas of competition and lines of communication appearing right now. For example, we remember that a couple of centuries ago, the main arena of competition was Europe, and the main ocean where the main lines of communication existed was the Atlantic Ocean. Today, there is consensus regarding the rising influence of the Pacific Ocean, and many people say that the coming 21st century will be the century of Asia. However, if we continue many contemporary trends, we can find that more and more countries in South Asia and in Africa are also economically rising, so maybe in the future Indian Ocean will be as important as the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans right now. Together with new lines of communication, new areas of competition, we can conclude that these rising powers in other non-Western regions in the future will challenge the traditional spheres of influence of contemporary Western powers led by the United States. Another process that influences significantly the geopolitical competition today and will continue to do it in the following years is the process of regionalism. Today, it is not so easy for regional powers to spread their influence within their own region because every state possesses a certain level of sovereignty, and therefore one of the solutions here is to establish a sort of regional community, regional alliance, and to create international institutions to ensure your influence over neighboring countries. And this process can be used in the opposite way as well. If you want to weaken your geopolitical opponent, one of the ways is to split the union that your opponent has created, or in other words, to make some sort of anti-regionalism. It is not enough to be economically powerful or prosperous to enter the geopolitical competition. And state should also care about its domestic political stability, because only domestic stability can allow it to concentrate on foreign policy and on competition with other countries at the regional or at the global level. Therefore, the emergence of new regional powers in many regions of the world, including Africa, the Middle East, even South Asia and Latin America, will very depend on the ability of regional powers to ensure their political stability and to guarantee absence of any domestic political crises. Finally, when we are speaking about geopolitical competition between the strongest powers, we should remember that this competition is not about maximization of your own power. Nobody today is trying to maximize, to achieve this maximum and to control the whole world or all resources around the globe. Rather, states prefer to gain some profit or to strengthen themselves relatively in comparison to their main competitors, or the other option is to weaken your competitor in order to remain the strongest in a region or in the world. So, geopolitical competition is not about being the only and therefore the strongest power, but rather about making yourself stronger than the others, than the main geopolitical opponents, or the states that you consider as a geopolitical opponent, or weakening these geopolitical opponents. Historically, geopolitical competition happened between the strongest states, and therefore, even now, in order to identify the key geopolitical players, we first of all look at politically or militarily strongest states. That is why we name among them the Russian Federation and China, because of their military capabilities, not only because of their historical experience. Today, however, economy has become more significant in terms of this geopolitical competition, and therefore the term geoeconomics emerged. In terms of geoeconomic competition, we also named the three main states, the United States and China as the global economic powers, and the Russian Federation, which was the global geopolitical power, is a global geopolitical power, and rather a regional geoeconomic power, but in terms of energy resources, it can be, by some scholars, called a global resource power, global energy superpower. But obviously, the economic power shift is happening much faster than the military power shift, and therefore, in our global analysis of geopolitical competition, we should very attentively look at this economic power shift and new economic instruments of influence that emerge, and economic spheres of influence, economic regionalism, economic institutions that allow great powers to spread their influence or to dominate in the region, to influence the other countries. Because economic power shift is happening too fast, geopolitical situation today does not reflect all these changes immediately. For example, many of contemporary institutions, international economic or financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and even the World Trade Organization, were established after the Second World War, and they reflected the power and dominance of Western countries. Today, these institutions are needed to be reformed because of emergence of new regional economic powers outside the Western bloc. However, this does not happen, therefore new alternative institutions appear in different parts of the world. The best example is China, that recently established the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. All this means that economically, at least in economic sphere, rising powers are ready to use geoeconomic instruments and their geoeconomic potential in order to guarantee their economic stability, economic security, and economic prosperity. And
we, by this, come to the conclusion that economic growth leads to growth of other power components, and this means that in the future, all these economic achievements can, or probably we can say, will be converted into geopolitical position. In the previous 3 lectures, in our 3 case studies, critical geopolitics told us 3 main things. First, that geopolitics, among these 3 examples, the United States, Russia, and China, historically emerged in the Russian Federation and in the United States, which means that geopolitical thinking was not and is not a worldwide phenomenon. It means that as it emerged in the West, many more Western countries may continue to use their geopolitical thinking and may enter the geopolitical competition in the future, especially the strongest powers in the European continent. The second thing is that despite the fact that geopolitics as a worldview emerged in Europe, its ideas, its concepts, and its main components can be taken by the other non-European countries to justify their foreign policy and regional hegemony. It is something that happened in 1930s with Japan when it invaded many countries in East and Southeast Asia, and today it is something that happens in China, as according to many scholars, China is ready to convert its economic power into geopolitical influence worldwide. And as example, they usually mean its initiative, the One Belt, One Road. If China is able to do that, therefore, any country that is becoming economically stronger can also, at a certain moment, start to use its economic power to achieve political or geopolitical goal at the regional or at the global level. So, in other words, the first 2 things tell us that geopolitics as a worldview may emerge probably in any country in the world, and any economically successful state at a certain moment can start to use its economic power as a geopolitical tool to achieve certain geopolitical results. The third thing that critical geopolitics told us was that the places where this competition may happen and the fact what country one state considers as an enemy or a friend or a competitor or an ally depends on the history of their relations, the current differences or contradictions in values between these 2 countries. So not only on some natural factors or geographic factors, but also on the things that show us how you consider yourself in the surrounding neighborhood or the other countries in the world. From all these trends that tell us about worldwide transition of power, of economic power, of emergence of geopolitical thinking in other places of the world outside the European region and outside the traditional geopolitical players, a number of research questions appear that may tell us that geopolitics, geopolitical competition, and the rising geopolitical players go far beyond the 3 examples that we discussed in the previous 3 lectures. For example, the first research question is what would be the geostrategy of rising India, which is the rising power in the region of South Asia, which is becoming economically more and more powerful, and what will be relations, geopolitical relations between India and its neighbors and with other countries in Africa, in Asia. We did not discuss the European countries or the European Union because of the contradictions between decision-making in the nation-states of the European Union and the European Union itself. But it goes without saying that the European Union is powerful enough and the community of European states is powerful enough to participate in global geopolitical competition. Even some European states like France, like Germany, like the United Kingdom, that in the middle of 2019 is deciding to leave the European Union, have enough power and enough geopolitical experience to participate in this global competition. Therefore, one of the research questions in geopolitics today is what would geopolitics in Europe look like? Will it be the European country, the sovereign nation state who participates in this geopolitics, or will any common geopolitics be formulated within the European Union? The Middle East region is known to us as a shadow belt, and we describe this region as the one without the obvious regional geopolitical leader. So today, one of the key questions in geopolitics is whether, in theory, this region can become geopolitically more united. What would be the geostrategy in the future of its key regional players that are competing with each other for regional dominance, meaning Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia? And what are the interests of other powers that will try to play their role in this regional competition in the Middle East shadow belt? Because of its geographic location, for many decades, Latin America was distant from geopolitical competition that happened in the Eurasian continent. However, today we can name at least one state here, which is Brazil, that is economically rising power, which is becoming regionally more and more influential, and probably in the future it may become a geopolitical player not only in the region but also participate in the global competition. Finally, if we look in the next couple decades, another question is how the African countries will act geopolitically. Today, there is a number of states here in the African continent that are very fast developing, where the population is quickly rising, and in 20 or 30 years, they will have many more economic resources ready to be converted into their geopolitical capabilities. Another question here in the African continent is the number of landlocked states that do not have access to the world ocean, but they will become powerful enough in order to struggle for such an access, so maybe we'll face another battle arena between the sea powers and the land powers. Finally, with the emergence of new states that may participate in geopolitical competition and with the future possible reorganization of the world geopolitical map, we can name several more research questions that show us another factors that will play their role in the global geopolitical changes. The first one is the changing geography of resource supplies, and here we can also name how demographic and economic trends will shape supply chains. We remember that in the previous decades and centuries, any changes in resource significance or communication lines caused geopolitical changes and another round of geopolitical competition. So here, this is another question to think about in the future decades. One more question is where new weapons, probably nuclear weapons, will cause tensions between neighbors. We know several cases of such tensions because of nuclear weapon deployment, for example, between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the American nuclear weapon located in Turkey and the Soviet in Cuba. Another good example is nuclear weapons in India and Pakistan and the political tensions between these two countries. So who knows what will happen if such nuclear weapon will appear in the region of the Middle East shadow belt and how it will shape the regional distribution of power and influence the geopolitical competition and the quest for dominance in this region. Climate change is a very powerful factor that may influence geopolitics of countries. Previously, we discussed the role of climate change in the Arctic geopolitics, that due to the global warming, the Northern Sea route became possible for to communicate regions of East Asia and Europe. However, there are many more examples. For example, how climate change may cause food or water shortage of food and water supplies in different regions of the world, and what are the geopolitical circumstances of this shortage. And the last but not the least, building of artificial areas in the seas. We gave examples of China that is currently building artificial islands, the Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, and its air bases there. There are many more places in the world where these artificial areas can be built, and building of such an island can totally change the geopolitical distribution of power in a particular region. Now, after we have discussed the geopolitical approach and how it can be used to describe international relations, it is time to discuss its limits. In other words, what aspects of international relations geopolitics does not or cannot explain.
To do this, we will try to compare geopolitics with several other international relations theories. On the one hand, by doing this, we will show that geopolitics is just one among many theories in IR that try to explain relations between countries, and this means that even when we use geopolitics to describe any situation in the world, we show only the part of picture. On the other hand, by doing this, we will show what aspects of international relations, for what aspects geopolitics is good to be used, and for what aspects, for what side of international relations, it is better to use other approaches. Let's start with realism. We remember that geopolitics is very close to realism. Some would even say that geopolitics was born in the family of the realist theories in the middle of the 20th century, when Nicholas Spikeman and Hans Morgenthau tried to combine benefits of the two theories. However, there are certain distinctions still. For example, for realism, the main variable is power itself in a broad sense, and the main issue for realism is war and peace, the question of war and peace, when states go to war, under what circumstances they decide to declare peace with each other, and the subfield of realism, which is called structural realism or neo-realism, also considers the role of structure in international relations, how the existing structure influences behavior of states. In geopolitics, it is a little bit different. For example, geopolitics pays more attention not to power itself in a broad sense, but to the location of power, to how geographic variables influence the issues of power. In other words, while for realism power is the most important variable, for geopolitics it is more important the possibility of power projection in a particular place, even if a certain state possesses a little bit less power than its opponent. Then for geopolitics, it is more important to speak about influence in a particular place rather than about the issues of war and peace. From the very beginning, geopolitics was about influence and control over particular places, trade routes, and so on. The one political practitioner who tried to combine these approaches was Henry Kissinger, and we remember his approach, which was about global equilibrium or the role of geopolitical factors in balance of power. So, in other words, the two approaches can be combined, and it is a good combination. However, we have just shown their peculiarities. Now let's compare geopolitics with another grand theory, which is liberalism. For liberalism, one of its distinctive characteristics is that absolute gains in international relations are possible. In other words, there is such a type of cooperation between states that can bring gains or benefits to both sides. So for liberalism, cooperation is more natural than competition. And contemporary liberalism also pays a lot of attention to institutions and their role in bringing states to peace and cooperation with each other. A good example is case of the European Union, how the institutions developed within this organization contributed to peace among the European countries in the recent 70 years. So if you want to study the role of institutions, the role of cooperation in international relations, you should use the liberal approach. In geopolitics, it is totally different. For example, there are no absolute gains in international relations according to geopolitics, only geopolitical competition. Competition for limited resources, competition for control over trade routes, and so on. Institutions can be in geopolitical competition, but they are just tools of influence over the other countries. We can use the very same example, the European Union, and geopolitically think about it as a tool for states, strong states like Germany or France, to influence the other countries of Europe, for example, in Eastern Europe. And finally, in geopolitics, state is the key actor in international relations. Why? In liberal approach, a state is one of many actors, among which we can also name some international organizations or even domestic organizations, communities, and so on. In geopolitics, it is a little bit different. For example, competition in geopolitics is not a legacy of age of imperialism. The very term geopolitics was such a legacy, and the geopolitical knowledge emerged in the age of imperialism. But we remember that geopolitical competition started many centuries before the age of imperialism, and the factor of geography contributed to competition between states throughout whole history of humanity. Finally, competition and contest in geopolitics is not between rich and poor necessarily, but between great powers for resources and influence. This competition may happen between rich and rich state, between poor and poor state. So the place of state in this chain of wealth is not so important like in the neo-Marxism approach. One more approach in international relations to explain politics among nations is international political economy. This approach focuses on wealth as a key driver of international cooperation and studies institutions, how institutions are used to gain more profit. For this approach, state is the key actor. However, state can cooperate with different organizations or with business, with private companies in order to maximize its profit, maximize its wealth. For geoeconomics, it is close but not the same. On the one hand, we can say that according to geoeconomics, state is looking for maximization of its gains. However, geoeconomics is continuation of the logic of geopolitics. So, in geoeconomics, state is looking for gains that can be converted in geopolitical advantage. For example, institutions here are used to gain more profit, which is associated with power of the state. And in geoeconomics, state is also key actor, but it also can cooperate with business in order to achieve more gains that can be converted into its power. In one of the previous lectures, we started to compare critical geopolitics with constructivism. So let's very quickly remind this comparison. Constructivism is a theory that revises the objectiveness of liberalism and liberalism. It believes that state is not a key actor in international relations and that we should focus on study of groups and persons who construct reality of international relations. So reality, in other words, is socially constructed. Critical geopolitics is very close to constructivism. It does not reject objectiveness of geopolitics, classical geopolitics, but it rather focuses on study of domestic context when and where this geopolitical knowledge emerged in a particular state. So for critical geopolitics, state is not a key actor as well, because it focuses on study of people who created all these geopolitical concepts, and it studies not only decision makers but also groups of people who participated in decision making, such as think tanks, academic community, and so on. The last but not the least, foreign policy analysis. This approach believes that state is key actor in international relations, but this actor is not homogeneous. It consists of many agencies, institutions, and decision makers who participate in decision-making process. And this is the main focus of study of foreign policy analysis. For geopolitics, it is not the same. Geopolitics, classical geopolitics, considers states as something homogeneous. It does not try to look inside the state. Critical geopolitics partly does this. It analyzes different agencies and how they produce geopolitical knowledge, but critical geopolitics focuses only on construction of geopolitical concepts, geopolitical views, not on anything else. So it is sort of limited version of foreign policy analysis from the point of view of geopolitics. And we can also name here one more subfield of geopolitics, which is anti-geopolitics. It tells us about the role of non-state actors in geopolitical competition. In other words, how these non-state actors contribute to competition among nations, among states at the regional or at the global level. One of the examples is the role of terrorist organizations and how they made possible conflict between the Muslim states and the United States in the early 2000s, when the United States, after the terrorist attacks, decided to invade Iraq. So, as you see in this graph, classical geopolitics, geoeconomics, and critical geopolitics altogether are just a little part of the complex knowledge, the field of science called international relations. These tools, these theories, these approaches are really very powerful. They emerged early,
and they were used very frequently by people to analyze relations, to advise to policymakers, and to construct geostrategies of countries. And they are very frequently used even now, but when you use them, don't forget that you describe only one side of international relations, and there are many more aspects that unfortunately cannot be described with the help of geopolitics and its variations, and for which you should learn more about alternative approaches, alternative theories of international relations. In the end of this lecture and of the course, let me finish with looking deeper in the future. And I will start with the quotation that we are the middle children of history, born too late to explore Earth and born too early to explore space. We can say that it is the last frontier for geopolitics. Today, technologies are developing very fast, and in the future, space exploration, space colonization, and new contexts for space resources and influence will become possible. We should remember that geopolitics is first of all about competition between countries on our planet, where geo means Earth. Space and Earth orbit can be considered within geopolitics, but they are viewed as a way of power projection on the Earth. The same is about space technologies. They are the issue of security and power projection. So in the future, when the space colonization, space exploration will become possible, we will start to speak about the next level of competition between countries, maybe between planets, which will be called astropolitics. But this will be another topic for another lecture of another course. Thank you for your attention.